Well, good morning on this Sunday after Christmas. I trust that all of your meetings and gatherings were a joyful occasion yesterday and that everyone was safe and glad that you're able to come back and have worship this morning. I'm finishing up the sermon series. We are in the very last sermon of the Plotline series that we've been tracing for the whole year. And now we'll come to the end. And what I want to do today is look back on, Revelation and some of the earlier passages to just make two very simple, sweeping statements. And then hopefully that will be a summarizing as well as a uh, summarizing. Uh, and so I want to do um, two points for the sermon. It's a very simple sermon. So uh, the first one, as we look at Revelation 21 and 22, is that the ending is better than the beginning. The ending is better than the beginning. So if you read Revelation 21, 22 before, you see how a lot of it goes back to the early chapters of Genesis. And God is restoring what has fallen in the garden. And it's the New Jerusalem that is restored. And so John makes this pretty clear in the first verse of our passage this morning. He says that it's a new heaven and a new earth. And obviously that goes back to Genesis 1:1. And then we have that phrase that follows, and the sea was no more. So that when we start Revelation 21, we're going back to the beginning of creation. And when we do, what we find is that God is once again creating his universe, his world, one out of nothing and chaos to the Garden of Eden, and then in the second one from a chaotic world to the New Jerusalem. But he also says, and there was no more, so sea was no more. And so when you look at Genesis 1, the sea, or the word deep, is the ocean, the uncontrollable ocean. It's the picture of lifelessness, it's chaos. And so um, what we have here is that all that is against life is taken away. So, just think of like the polarized caps, and there's debate on the global warming and all. But let's just say that if global warming is true and all the polarized caps melt, then the ocean level will rise up, meaning there'll be less land to live. And the less land to live, there will be less life. Life does not flourish well, human life, in an ocean type of setting. And so when John says there is no more sea, what he's saying is death has gone, lifelessness is gone, and what has come is life. Land equals life. And so John himself says, and death shall be no more. So that when we look at the entire city of New Jerusalem, when we read the last two chapters, we see that it is made out of precious stone, and the city itself is made out of pure gold. You have the 12 foundation stones made out of 12 precious stones. And then you have 12 gates, and each gate is carved out of a pearl, single pearl. And then it's adorned with jasper and sapphire, emerald, oxen. And all of these precious stone, it goes back to the Garden of Eden when the writer says that there's refined gold or pure gold in the garden and onyx as well. And so, the entire city, its glory is seen in that it's full of precious stones. Now, John also says that the entire city is pictured as a temple. That no temple was necessary in New Jerusalem because the whole city is a temple. And that's an important point because when we are given the dimensions of New Jerusalem, on one level, what we see is that this is the magnitude of the city is amazing. Yeah, what is it? 700-800 miles or something, I forgot, but 12,000 strata is 700-800 miles, I think, and that's how high the city is, how wide and how broad. So this is a humongous city, but the measurements are also a perfect cube. And as some of you are well aware, the perfect cube, the only other dimension is found in the Holy of Holies. And so what John is saying is all of creation has been transformed into the Holy of Holies, where we get to experience God in his fullness. But scholars have also noted more and more in recent years that in Jerusalem or in Genesis, the garden is a temple itself. You know, you got the cherubim and the exit that goes out eastward. And so you have a temple there. And so both New Jerusalem and the garden is a temple structure. And then you also get the rivers of water flowing from underneath the throne of God, and it spreads throughout New Jerusalem. And in the same way, in the garden, what you have is the water that flows out from the center into four rivers and nourishing the land. And then the trees of life are planted on both sides. So you got the repetition of the tree of life. And then you have the statement by John, there will be no more curses. And that obviously goes back to the curses that came because of the consequences of Adam and Eve's sin. And then there are two things that I want to point out. So we can ask the question, what is the difference between New Jerusalem and the garden? And in one sense, you could say, well, there's no more sea, and then it's all light. There's no more darkness. Those are two foundational changes, and that is true. But there are two things that are different from New Jerusalem and Genesis. First, there is no Satan at the end in New Jerusalem. There is no tempter. In fact, he has been casted into the deepest part of hell, and forever he's prevented from being an accuser against the sons and daughters of God. So that part is a huge change. And then secondly, all the major components in the garden are found in Revelation 21 and 22, except for one thing. And it's a prominent thing in Genesis, and that's the tree of knowledge of good and evil. There is no tempting tree in New Jerusalem, only the tree of life. And that's a huge point to remember. And the question is, why is that? And the answer is simple. It is same as the last week, so that the bride, the bride's purity is founded on the groom's holiness, his sacrifice of himself. And in the same way, our credential or ability to enter into New Jerusalem is not based on our ability to pass the test, but instead Jesus who passed the test. And because he passed the test, we no longer have to pass the test. And so it's no longer necessary for the tree to be there. And so there is a sense of peace in our stay in New Jerusalem. In fact, if I wanted to answer the question, well, what mistake did Satan make? So we're looking at this narrative from the very beginning, and Satan starts this war with God through his image bearers. And what we find is that Satan thinks he has thought it all through, but there was one thing that he has missed. It's that one thing that he missed, that has caused him to lose the war. And that one thing is that I think he underestimated the degree to which the father would go to deliver his children. You know, I think he's thinking, wow, I think there's much that the father would do, but would he actually send his own son for creatures created out of dust? And I think he underestimated the love of God for us. And so what we find here is that God has demonstrated tremendous love for us. And I think Satan was not able to account for that. And because of that, I think he lost the war. He didn't strategize properly. Anyway, that's my response in a narrative type of answer to the question. Now, there's a second point. And the second point that I like to make is uh, God will get us there. Will get us there. If the ending is better than the beginning, then God will get us there. So, you know, often when we experience suffering, we ask the why question, and there are hundreds or thousands of books written throughout church history on why people suffer and why there are wars. Columbine shootings, and you get all the newspaper articles and books, or the space shuttle explosion, or 9/11. You get all of these events. And when the tragedy occurs, people are always asking why. And when you look at the scriptures, what you find is that the Bible never answers the why question, right? I mean, I don't think I even need to emphasize that point here, but God doesn't. He certainly had a chance to respond in a more meaningful way in the book of Job, but he does not. And then Jesus, when the worshipers in Jerusalem were slaughtered by Pilate's centurions, and then when the Tower of Siloam fell over in Luke 13, uh, and people were asking, "Why, Lord? Why?" And he could have responded by giving an intellectual answer and explain why, but he does not. In fact, he almost turns it to like a Southern Baptist preacher and says, unless you repent, you too will perish. And so Jesus doesn't answer and God doesn't answer the why question. Instead, what the scriptures offer is divine presence. You know, God is with you. That's one of the major themes from our plot line. Now, we are never alone because he is with us. In his name, I am the one with you. You know, and that Jesus, his final words to the disciples, lo, I am with you till the end of the age. Emmanuel, God with us. And so what we have is a God who extends his presence to us without answering the questions that are generated in our mind when we look at the world and wonder why it's out of sync. There's an interesting translation issue in Matthew 10. Jesus offers encouragement to his disciples because he warns them that a time will come when you will suffer as witnesses to me. But when you suffer, just remember that the Father uh, two sparrows that are sold for a penny. So that's how little value they are. When one of them falls, they do not fall without the Father. So literally in the Greek, it's without the Father. Uh, and so without the Father's what? And translators have thought that, well, maybe it's incomplete. Maybe we need to add something there. And so if you look at the various translations, some have added without the Father's care, or without the Father's consent or permission, or without the Father's will, or without the Father's knowledge. He knows of all of these things. But I believe there's something deeper that's going on in this passage. I think what God is saying is that he is not only aware of every detail in creation, and he not only cares about every uh, living being and what they go through, but that they also, uh, but that he's also with each of the creatures in this world when they suffer. He comes alongside them. He, uh, his presence is there, not to answer questions, but to bring comfort in their heart that they're not alone. Now, Jesus is saying, look, he's doing it with the sparrows, but they will not fall without the Father's presence. How much more will you, disciples, when you're struggling and suffering, how much more will God be with you? And so I love the way the one commentator put it. It's Bruner. He says, as though the Father not only determines or knows the bird's fall, but even accompanies it. He walks alongside. And then he says, great love is this. And so if God will do this even with the sparrows, how much more will he do with the disciples? And so, when you look at the questions of suffering, when you ask why questions, remember we have a plot line, a long line, and then to the left, that's uh, the past, to the right is the future. And then if you ask why questions, you're looking backwards. So you're asking for a causal explanation, what occurred that gave rise to the suffering. Uh, but there are also questions that can be answered in terms of looking forward. So, it's a story and we're progressing along the plot line, and you can keep looking backwards or you can look forwards. And what I find is that much of scripture, when it talks about suffering and when it seeks to encourage us, it doesn't go backwards, it goes forwards. The ending is much better than the beginning, and I will get you there. And so that hope will enable you to persevere through persecution and suffering. And so that's what I find. In fact, when you go to John 9, and it's that famous passage of a man born blind, and that's a theological conundrum, because if the man is born blind, and if every sin is a result of um, a willful sin, right? Every suffering is a result of willful sin. And the question is, who suffered or who sinned in order for this man to be born blind? And no matter how you answer the question, it doesn't quite fit the neat theological categories. But Jesus comes along and says, the problem is that you're asking why question and going back, and that's why you're getting all tangled up. But there are times when you ask questions that are future looking in view of for what purpose. And in that way, he does give an answer. He says that all the suffering has occurred in order that we might uh, be objects of glory, objects of God's trophy in the very end. So that when we look at our lives and we make it to the very end, because God will take us to the end, and then when we look around, what we find is that, wow, uh, he is faithful and he brought us to the end. And because he has done so, we are trophies of his grace. And so each one of us will be a testimony of God's faithfulness. Um, so in our passage this morning, what you have is that God will wipe away all of our tears, and you have that comfort passage. But then you also heard the phrase, God will save all of our tears in a bottle. And that's from David, I think Psalm 58 or so. And all of these is a reminder that when we suffer, it's not wasted. God remembers, and it will be used in some way for his glory. And so, it's, if you ask yourself, is suffering worth it? Well, worth it compared to what? Is it worth it for the discomfort or the loss of reputation or job or whatever struggles you may have had this year? Or is it worth it, your suffering, if you know that God will bring glory to himself through your struggles? It would be very difficult to say, no, it would not be worth it. There's a line that I picked up this week. It goes, all will be well in the end. all will be well in the end. That's a nice sentiment. But if it isn't, then it's not the end yet. I really like that. Yeah, I look at the world and all will be well in the end. I believe that. I have hope in that. But if it's not all well right now, then the end has not yet come. And God will do what he has promised. I'm going to close this sermon or series. It's with a Brazilian parable. And Max Lucado was a missionary in Brazil, and he um, brought this parable over, and I found it in one of his books. And it's just this nice, simple, dramatic way of conveying a very simple truth. Don't judge God until you get all the pieces, all the facts. And so it's a parable, and I will read it. It's about 2 minutes long. Okay. There was once an old man who lived in a tiny village. He was a poor woodcutter for the village, but he was the envy of all, for he owned a beautiful white stallion that all coveted, even the king himself. Many people offered him outrageous sums for that steed, but the old man always refused. That horse is not like a horse to me. It's part of the family. And how can you sell your own family member? He used to say. When I read this part, I keep thinking of um, Nathan confronting David and the story of the lamb. And it's not, it's that lamb that David had taken. It's not. It's a member of the family. And next line. Well, one day he awoke to find the horse gone, and all the villagers came out and said to him, "You old fool! You see, you should have sold the horse. Now someone has stolen it. You could have been rich. Now you will always be poor. You have been cursed with the misfortune." But the old man replied, "Don't speak too quickly. Just say that the horse is gone. But how do you know it is a curse or not?" The villagers shook their head. He must be in a state of denial, they thought. The horse is gone. That is a curse. Then 15 and 15 days later, the horse returned. He wasn't stolen. He had run away. But not only did he return, he also brought with him a dozen wild horses. Once again, the villagers all gathered around the woodcutter's home and began to exclaim, "Oh man, you were right and we were wrong. It was not a curse but a blessing. You can now break these horses and sell them and make far more than before." But uh, the old man replied, "Once again, you go too far. Just say that the horse is back and nothing more. How do you know if this is a blessing or not? You have only seen a fragment. Don't judge the whole story." Right? That's the theme here. But the villagers didn't agree. All they could see was the cash these horses could have brought in or would bring in. Now the old man had only one son. This lad began the task of breaking these wild horses. But after a few days, one of the wild horses threw him off and broke both of his boy's legs. And the villagers came by again and said, "You proved to be right. The return of your horse wasn't really a blessing. You have nothing to show but a son who can't even help you now and a bunch of useless wild horses. It was a curse." But it so happened that a month later, the country went to war against the neighboring country, and the young men of the village were drafted and sent off to the war. But because the son of this old man had broken legs, he was excluded. Once again, the villagers gathered around this old man's home, crying and screaming because their sons had been taken. "You were right," they were. "Your son's accident was a blessing. His legs may be broken, but at least he is with you, safe and protected." And then the last line goes, "But the old man replied, no one knows. Just say that your son went to war and mine stayed. But do not say it is a blessing or a curse. Only God knows." And I think there's a tremendous truth into this parable that we continue to make judgments about God's story in the middle of the story. And the only way we can do that is once we get to the very end and then look back at all that the God has planned and God seeks to accomplish and all the details of the story that we're not even aware of. And so, this year may have been a difficult year. It certainly seems like a difficult year